Good afternoon, and I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, do please do a dance, wave your arms around, or make it known that you are having difficulty. Anyway, welcome to this masterclass. In fact, this double masterclass, because although it was advertised for the Spanish dance, we're also giving you the Fairy of Joy. Now, I think it's quite interesting that when you sort of start looking at these two productions, we are working with two very well-known ballets, Swan Lake and Sleeping Beauty, and we're looking at productions that in some senses sort of bookmark the beginning and end of Frederick Ashton as artistic director of the Royal Ballet. I think it's also interesting to note that with Swan Lake, premiered, as it tells you in your programme, in December 1963, we're showing you the Spanish dance, and not some of the more familiar items. I think usually if people sort of think about Frederick Ashton's contribution to that Swan Lake, the sections that they would come up with are the pas de quatre or indeed the final act. Both well known, both very beautiful. If we're looking at the Sleeping Beauty, which is from December 1968, then probably the item that people will be most familiar with is the Awakening pas de deux that was added at that time. But no, we are doing the more unusual, which is really one of the purposes of these masterclasses. As I say, these are works that relate to sort of the ends of the time that Ashton was the artistic director, 1963 to 1970. I think it was actually quite enlightening if he really did actually say that when he took up the artistic directorship of the Royal Ballet, it was somewhat like James I succeeding Queen Elizabeth. I think he actually, when you think about those two monarchs, they actually do say quite a lot about those two artistic directors as well. But we won't go into that sort of a history lesson. When Alexander Bland was writing the 50th anniversary history of the Royal Ballet, he picked up and said that there was a trio of contributions that Ashton really made as artistic director in terms of the repertory. First, there was his affinity with French culture, and I think that comes through often with the music that Frederick Ashton chose to choreograph to. Also, of course, it reflects his interest in bringing in Roland Petit to create works on the company. Secondly, he stresses that the repertory reveals Ashton's admiration for the achievements of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, and I would emphasise that this is particularly in the 1920s, so the works that Ashton himself would have had the chance to see once he had moved to Britain, and most notably for bringing in the works of Bronislava Nijinská. And this is really restoring Nijinská's reputation. And I would, as a side, add, I'm sorry, this is an advertisement and completely unashamed. On the 7th of March, International Women's Day, I shall be doing a lunchtime presentation at the Victoria and Albert Museum on Bronislava Nijinská, and that will certainly include her work in Britain and her collaborations and involvement with Frederick Ashton. Advertisement over. Also, I think in that category, one can remember that it is really in Ashton's directorship that Balanchine's works come into the repertory. And interestingly, a work such as the Polotzian dances from Prince Igor turns up. Thirdly, and most significantly for today, Bland emphasises Ashton's passionate loyalty to the classical tradition. I think what he means by this is largely the loyalty to the creations of the late 19th century in Russia, the works by Petipa and Ivanov. I think it's worth remembering that Ashton's first commission is for Nureyev to stage Kingdom of the Shades, and throughout there is this sort of recurring interest in putting on what we refer to now as the classics. I'm sure many of you remember those sort of comments about how Ashton was noticed watching yet another performance of Sleeping Beauty, and when asked why he was there, said he was having a private tutorial. I think it was very significant that he did have that sort of very strong basis in those works, and I think we must see that that was very much part of his heritage as a dancer. Both with Rambert and with de Valois, there was recognition of the importance of those works, and so all their pupils would be immersed in them, whether that was in class or in performance. What Bland doesn't mention, and I think it is just worth commenting on, there is also, of course, a continuing interest in presenting the dramatic works, so the works by Macmillan and, of course, Tudor's repertory coming in. But just to make some comparisons, of the works we're looking at today, they both actually had producers. So it wasn't just a choreographer producing a new version, there was a producer, and that producer would then involve choreographers. In the case of Swan Lake, it was Robert Helpman, choreographer, dancer, actor, man of theatre, and for Sleeping Beauty, it was Peter Wright, who we are pleased to see here today, who Ashton invited to produce the Sleeping Beauty for the Royal Ballet, having seen his production for Cologne and felt that he was the right man for the job. In terms of similarities as well, I think it's important to remember that they both replaced well-loved, but by the 1960s, well-worn productions. In the case of Sleeping Beauty, it was replacing that very famous Messel production, and interestingly, it's the designers that these are referred to by. So the production that reopened the Royal Opera House after the Second World War in 1946. In the case of Swan Lake, it's replacing the versions, the revised version in this case, by Leslie Hurry. And I think in both instances, this led to a certain amount of a battle with the traditionalists who wanted to keep things and preserve the status quo. Third common point for these two productions, they are both set in sort of medieval Gothic designs. For Swan Lake, it was Carl Toms. For Sleeping Beauty, Leila de Nobili, who basically headed a team incorporating the scenic artist Henry Barden and really designer of animal characters Dobrzynski. Interestingly, I think in this case, Leila de Nobili was the one who had the real concept and played a very leading role in the production. But both were designers who throughout their careers were fascinated by what I would describe as a sort of Victorian view of the Middle Ages. Now, I think if we think of the 1960s, this is highly relevant. It's the point when actually there's a sort of revival of interest in Victorian art, revival of interest in the pre-Raphaelites. Indeed, Sleeping Beauty was at times referred to as the pre-Raphaelite Sleeping Beauty. Ashton as artistic director. I think many of us look back, whether we were active theatre goers at that time or not, regarding this as actually a golden age of the Royal Ballet. If we think of Ashton's own creations at that time, The Dream, Monotones, Enigma Variations, and the rather more modern jazz calendar, one thinks of some really interesting productions. These are also the great years, I think, in terms of some of the dancers. It's not today. Today's dancers are wonderful too, don't get me wrong. But when we think of the magic names like Fontaine and Nureyev, Sibley and Dow, Seymour and Gable, Berry-Ossifer, McCleary, Parkinson, and of course, Monica Mason. It was a period also when the corps de ballet was superbly developed. And I think, that's one of the things that really became a trademark of the Royal Ballet, is that it was such a great company. Now, I'm not going to go through a great detail about the Swan Lake. We want to see the Spanish dance. Just a few sort of reminders about the production. This was one of the versions that included a prologue, rather sort of the popularised via Baumeister. So we saw the princess being transformed into a swan, which of course helps the audience's understanding of what the action is. Throughout the work, there was additional choreography, new choreography by 3 choreographers, Ashton, Nureyev, and Maria Fay. So essentially, all 3 contributed to the ballroom divertissement. different productions will always number their acts differently. And so in this version, as Christopher was mentioning, the ballroom was regarded as Act 2. It's partly to do with placing your intervals, but also, of course, it was decided to have a prologue, Act 1, Scene 1, then Act 1, Scene 2 was the lakeside scene, and then Act 2 became the ballroom. So yes, when one's sort of being pedantic about these things, it can get a little bit confusing. I think when we look at the Spanish dance, we can always think of Ashton's own Hispanic background, having grown up in South America. I think it's also interesting, and I'm sure Monica will say more about this, that he was working with at least one dancer who had had some knowledge of Spanish dance training. It fascinates me that dancers who sort of began training in South Africa or Southern Africa all seem to have learnt Spanish dancing as part of their training. But perhaps Monica will say a bit more about that. There's not a lot actually written about this dance. Clive Barnes criticised it as being rather Gorski-esque. By this time, of course, audiences and critics had seen the Russian productions and the traditional Gorski interpretation. I would argue that what we're probably looking at is balletic Spanish, and it's much more of a wider genre. I think it's actually very interesting how often when you see ballets to the same piece of music or arrangements to pieces of music, they can be mounted other sides of the world. And I'm not talking so much now when we can see everything on YouTube if you want to, but how often different choreographers will actually do something relatively similar because the music is informing them, and so much is based on the music. Okay, so I think it's time for us to move into our first section of masterclass, looking at the Spanish dance from Swan Lake. Originally, this was danced by Monica Mason, Georgina Parkinson, Desmond Doyle, and Christopher Gable. My, what a cast. And we're very lucky to have Monica here to introduce this work and to show us how it should be done. Thank you very much.
Let's just speak first. Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon, everybody. There's a mouse somewhere. Is there a mouse? No? It's the screen. I think it's interesting to think that in this instance, with this particular production of Swan Lake, actually the designer didn't get a mention, Jane, and I think I'm right in saying it was Carl Toms. Yes, that's right. So when I very first joined the Royal Ballet in 1958, Sir Frederick Ashton was in the process of choreographing and creating Ondine. And in fact, my very first rehearsal that I ever went into was on day one when I joined the company. And I went into a rehearsal room, and the first person I saw at the front of the room was Frederick Ashton. And the person standing talking to him was Margot Fonteyn. And I thought, I've certainly died and gone to heaven. And I was put into one of the Ondines. And of course, Sir Fred was literally struggling, I think is not too strong a word to say, with the music of Henze, Hans-Werner Henze, which used to arrive in dribs and drabs from Germany, and was then interpreted because it didn't come recorded, it came in a score. The pianist had to try and lift the music off the orchestral score in order for Sir Fred to work on it. And it sounded extremely weird to us, I have to say. It was not easy. And it was sort of in the days before people really counted music. In those days, we just listened like mad. It's much more helpful these days. Dancers are helped enormously by notators and ballet masters and mistresses who really can break the music down and help them to learn it quicker. But of course, it's by listening, you learn it in an entirely different way. Anyway, so Fred said to me one afternoon, along with my friend Vivian Lorraine, who had also joined from South Africa, would the two of us please stay behind at the end of the rehearsal? He wanted to use us both to work out some steps for Act 3. Well, you can imagine. I mean, here was this master, and, we were just willing to do anything. If he'd said, stand on your head, we would have done it. And so we worked out some of the steps that he wanted to try out on the full company for Act 3. And in fact, a lot of those steps lasted. And so I always feel kind of very proud, really, that Vivian and I had such a hand in helping him, it seemed. We thought we were helping him, and I think we probably were, to sort out some steps for Act 3. Then we fast forward 5 years to 1963, and Sir Fred said to me, I'm going to be re-choreographing the Spanish dance for Swan Lake, and I understand that you studied Spanish dancing when you were in South Africa. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, would you stay behind and help me with the Spanish? So once again, I had the great honor of being able to be in there at the very beginning. And clearly, right from the word go, he didn't really want what I saw as authentic flamenco, which I'd learnt as a 12-year-old in Johannesburg. This was much freer, and of course one realized immediately that he wanted ideas, and out of these ideas he embroidered and created this piece, this work. And so when Janetta thought it might be rather a good idea for us to be able to show you what the Spanish dance looked like, because we're unlikely, I think, probably ever to see it again now, but it's part of the Royal Ballet heritage. And Christopher Carr, who is on a wonderful film on YouTube, dancing with Ashley Page, Rosalind Eyre, and Jackie Tallis. Now, of course, Ashley Page has gone on to be a world-famous choreographer, and Rosalind Eyre and Jackie Tallis were ballet mistress and assistant ballet mistress for years in the company. But it was created originally on Georgina and myself, and Georgina had never done any Spanish, and she was a principal dancer, and I was not yet a principal dancer. I was a soloist, and so Desmond Doyle and Christopher Gable, who were these two very eminent principal dancers, I felt very much like the poor relation in the quartet, but I was only too happy to show them how you have to keep down and how you can't do your heel beats coming up and down. You've got to keep. I'm very pleased, I said to Jane, that Marina Groot, there's a woman in this country called Marina Groot, who is Mrs. Spanish Dance. Yes, oh, there's somebody put their hand up there. And of course, Marina and I know each other well, and we often laugh and giggle together. And of course, her version of Spanish is the real thing. What we're seeing today is very much Sir Fred, with his background in South America originally, but with his genius for taking a little seed and making a flower grow. So first of all, we're going to look at Christopher Carr teaching Leo Dixon, Letitia Diaz, Misha Bradbury, and Calvin Richardson, who are very kindly here on their day off. And we had, I think, Christopher took about an hour, perhaps not quite that, to show them about 4 weeks ago. And then the other day we had a sort of tickle through for 10 minutes before a performance. So they're going to get up and be wonderful when the time comes. But in the meantime, we thought it'd be rather interesting because Ben Gartside, who is here, filmed it in the studio. And the wonderful Lorraine Gregory, who is here and wearing a microphone to help when she needs to, is a notator with the Royal Ballet. And she has kind of taken it and written it and found it and researched it. So we have a pretty accurate version, I think. Christopher Carr, of course, said he didn't really remember it until he watched himself on the film, and then, and of course, in Christopher's meticulous way, took it to pieces and put it together again. So I'm really here as a sort of stand-in for Christopher Carr today, because he's in Dresden, looking after another Ashton work. And so we'll take a look, if we may, please, at the film of the rehearsal. Thank you.
From hand and waist, you do See what I mean? Yeah, and then you do girl, and then boy, and then girls you do. Exactly, it's all pushed and very, very stylish. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And boy, girl, around 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2, 2, 3, 4, around 5, 6, 1. So 5, 6, you have to go onto this front foot, which is unusual. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. Yeah? Just play the run round. And 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 1, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, pull away. 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5 up, 6. 5 up, 6, 1. Yeah, go got it. Yeah, yeah. Are you right on it?
I can do 6 before.
6 before, second follow. And. Stiff the brush, you go. Bang! I know it's early days. Wah! And pull her. Exactly. 64, we should be level. Yeah. And. 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, and 6. Balance. Go a bit lower, and you should be absolutely flat. Yeah, absolutely flat out. And lift your head slightly. So it's actually in line, but you've broken your back. Don't break your back. You should be facing the back.
Me?
Yes. Yeah. No. So the boy and the girl are the same. Yeah. Yeah. So, you're going to do, we're going to swap sides. You do the same, but the first time you don't swap sides. So we're going to do yum, da, 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 da. Should now be facing the front. Dum, yum, da, 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 da. Yeah? So on that, we were doing left, right together. Left, right together. So she's going to go around the back of you first, she's going to go around the front. And 1 and 2 and 3, 1, 1 and 2, no, should revolve, revolving.
No, it's me.
Yeah.
I got this.
So first time, where are you? No. First time, you're facing the front, she's facing the back. And left and right and chum. Left and, you're going around the back, so swap sides the second time. First time, where are you? You're here. First time. So we go together, showing centre. So we're doing left, right together. They're really small steps. Ready, and left and right together. Left and right together. Yes? Don't you love it? Divine, isn't it? Shall we listen? Not too fast. Why don't we do from ya ba 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 yam da 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 da? It's the turns. Yeah? And So 4, you finish by 4. So you do 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and 5 and a 6 and a 1 and a 2 and 3 and a 4 and a 5 and a 6 and a 3. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and 5 and a 6 and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, 5, 6 on the end, on the point. Yeah? So girls, we love this. Drop this shoulder. Pull, 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 pull. Stir, stir. Stir. Yeah? Should we try? What?
The first time. Oh my God.
Yeah?
Really good.
Yes. And the feet keep going. Yeah. Shall we same place? The stirring. Ready? And now. 1, 2, 3. Left, right, together. And 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5 and a 6 of that. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. Yeah. So the girls, as we're in a straight line with this, the girls are very slightly downstage of you, and to that side of you, and to that side of the boy. Yeah? The t-shirt. 1 and a 2 and a 2 and does not happen. Yeah? Right, are we okay? Don't make it too zigzag. It's more or less coming forward. More or less, but I love the back foot. Yeah.